There's a pretty one, Ulysses. There it is.
Hello BookTube, I'm Sean the Book Maniac. Welcome to my channel and to another Friday Reads. Here I am in the den with my not all, but well, with a lot of books behind me, which is a great backdrop. I don't have a whole lot of personal news. I have good news and bad news about job hunting. The good news is the English composition marking service job that I got that I was worried was drying up. It's not drying up at all. I've been being kept quite busy since I last mentioned that, so that makes me happy. It's not going to be enough. Well, the thing that I have to keep in mind is that once Kenji gets here, and there's no real update on that situation, Kenji and I are still keeping our fingers crossed that he will get here by Christmas, but, whoa, oh dear, I kicked this tripod. Still hoping that Kenji will get here by Christmas, but, yeah, there's a whole bunch of complicating factors. So, fingers crossed. But once he gets here and gets working, he'll have no trouble finding a job. He wants to do restaurant type work, and every place in the city is hiring, desperately hiring. I think I mentioned this before, if I was a little younger and more able-bodied, I would be quite happy to do that too. But the kind of work that I'm qualified for, slim pickings, but so be it. So once he gets here, gets established, probably I am earning enough money that once we're sharing the rent and sharing the costs of everything, I'm probably almost there, but I'm not there yet. So the good news is a lot more work from the new Tokyo job. And the bad news, I guess, is that I didn't get a call for an interview for the library position. So I guess I had zero experience other than being a reader and, being academically trained. I had no experience whatsoever, so it's now been a week since that competition closed, and I haven't heard from them. So actually, I've forgotten. When was it? Has it been 1 week or 2 weeks? Maybe there's still time, but I pretty much think that's not going to happen. It would be nice to be pleasantly surprised, but feeling optimistic about life. As I was saying to my dear friend and your dear friend Joe. Joe is one of the most wonderful BookTube consumers, BookTube commenters out there. And I was just telling her yesterday that the more I put myself out there in the community and start going to literary readings and start making connections and this, that, and the other thing, these things tend to kind of unfold by word of mouth and by being kind of in the world, rather than just holed up in my apartment reading and whatnot. So yes, although let me make it clear, I am dying to get out into the literary community in Saskatoon, not because I'm hoping to get a job out of it, just because it's my people. So, all right, that's all I got to say personally, and let's get to the books. I've had a great reading week. I have one bale to tell you about. I have finished 3, and I have started one that I haven't actually finished. So let's start with the negative. Speaking of Jo Smith, she'll be disappointed to hear this news, but I bailed very early on this Saskatchewan novel by a settler novelist, The Wheaton, by Joanne Jackson. The voice just didn't work for me at all. It was in the voice of a young widower that was very circumspect and kind of a loner, and decides to apply for a job at an old folks home after his wife dies. The first person narrative voice just grated on me because it was chatty and bubbly and didn't fit the character at all, and I didn't really care for the writing, and that's all I'm going to say about it. I read 14 pages, and that was about 7 pages more than I needed to have made up my mind. So in other words, I think 14 pages was an honest try. And I have finished 3 books. I ended up quite enjoying this Chantemesle. I'll put up the cover gift. This is a bareback hardcover from the library, and I know a few of you smile when I use the term bareback, but I think that's the right term for a hardcover with no dust jacket. Isn't it a bareback book? Somebody tell me what I should say, or whether you like. Is bareback kind of another vlog, Sean the Book Maniac piece of vocabulary? Anyway, Chantemesle by Fedden. I mentioned, I think it was just last week, that in the first half there weren't a lot of people, and there were more people in the second half. So I enjoyed the second half more. Just a gorgeous piece of writing, set in Normandy, in his childhood, And boy, there were odd characters lurking in the woods and so on, and he meets them all and gets to know them all as a 8-year-old or 10-year-old, or maybe by the end of the memoir, he's 13 or 14. There's stories of puppy love with eccentric neighbors, and the curious thing is that his parents, who I assume were in the house there with him, don't show up in the memoir at all. And there may have been very good reasons why he just kept them out. But they were, I think his father was an artist and his mother was a novelist. I hadn't heard of either of them. And they were killed in a train crash when he was, I think, in his 20s or 30s. But anyway, they're not in the book. And there's a lot of other fascinating stuff that is in this memoir, Chantemesle, and I enjoyed it. Yeah, it wasn't quite a Sean book. I give it 4 stars, but gorgeous piece of nature memoir. And if you're into that sort of thing, do check it out. It's published in 1964. I believe it's still in print. When I went to bed last night, I had 10 pages in each of these last 2 books to finish, so I woke up early, read them, loved them. 2 5-star reads. They're very different from each other with some very intriguing similarities. First one is this Indigenous memoir, autobiographical fiction or short story collection. You could label it any of those ways. The Raindancer by Enole Bellegarde, and that's an ugly library book, so I will put it down and put up the cover gif. I loved it. As I said last week, it is not of high literary quality, but oh my god, it is just jam-packed with story. The author has written a fictionalized account of her grandmother and other ancestors and great aunts and cousins and so on in Cree, Saulteaux, and Assiniboine tribes in southern Saskatchewan. And she's changed the names and locations and so on to protect her family, but she's based a lot of it on taped interviews she did with her kokum, her grandmother, who is one of the main characters in the story. In its rawness, it read very much like an oral narrative. I thought it was profound. I was just completely absorbed in it from start to finish. I could see that in the hands of a more experienced writer, it could have been better, but I thought it was a wondrous story, quite competently told by a loving granddaughter. The residential school atrocity is woven through the generations of the family. It's a tough book. There is a lot of domestic violence in the book. A lot of the women stand by their man, and it's awful to read about. And it's very honest. So, I mean, it's tough reading, just like the next one I'm going to tell you about. It's a first-person account of what it's like to grow up on reservations in Saskatchewan over the generations, and the way that the residential school fucked up the family. Not that they didn't have their own problems going way back before. Well, actually, it's interesting. This is not a accusatory book, like a very honest accounting of what happened in the residential schools, and I was quite well apprised of what happened in the residential schools, and every time I read more stories, more true stories of what happened there, it's a painful read and a very important thing for settler Canadians to know about. Bellegarde doesn't write an angry accusatory narrative. She just writes, in a way, a simple story of abuse and addiction across generations and what happened at the residential schools, and there are some connections made. But now that I'm remembering that the residential school system was instituted in the 19th century, in fact, it may have played a role in the earliest generation of people in her family, because it opens with, I think it's the author's great-great-grandparents, maybe, and there was abuse and neglect in that family going way back, and I think that earliest part of the story is the late 19th century, and the residential schools were in full bloom by then. So the fact that the author doesn't make that linkage, I think, makes it a richer narrative, because the reader, especially the settler reader, has to do some work. And especially when you're reading against a stereotype that Indigenous people are just drug addicts, alcoholics, no good for nothing, lazy people, which is a horrible stereotype, and it's the stereotype that I grew up with. That was not inculcated by my immediate family, but it certainly was ever present in the culture in which I grew up. So reading this story against that stereotype, it was a profound reading experience for me. I recommend it very highly. It's a self-published book. I don't know how widely available it is. For example, I don't know if it's on ebook or Scribd, but I think a quick Google search will help you out. I loved it. And I just this morning finished Bhaunri by Anukrti Upadhyay, this Rajasthani novella that it was a companion volume but not a sequel, and no other connection between this and Daura, which I read at the beginning of the year. I think it was the first book I finished in 2022. I love this. I have to say that Daura was a more impactful read, at least now I've only finished it 45 minutes ago, but this was an amazing story as well. 5-star read. I loved it so much. Daura, there's something really special about Daura, and this came in, I would say, a close second. So I mean, I recommend this incredibly highly. What a dark story this was. Bhaunri, she grows up in one tribal group in Rajasthan. She gets promised as a child to a man at another tribal group, and he comes to collect her when she's, I don't know, 15 or 16, I don't know, and she goes to live with him and his family. And he is sexy as all get out, built like a brick shithouse. She is really drawn to him, and he is very cold to her. And she comes to live with him and his parents. And the father is mostly absent, a horrible drinker, womanizer, and Bhaunri's husband and his father barely speak. They hate each other that much. The mother-in-law character, Mai, is benevolent, takes Bhaunri under her wing and tries to protect her from all this misogynistic bravado, one-upmanship, really violent atmosphere of the home. It's a tough read, resplendent with all the colorful detail about the food, the cooking, the festivals, the spirituality, the neighbors, all of that is just rich. And then there's this really tough story, and what you can't help happening is to just fall in love with Bhaunri, because she is so strong, she has a sharp tongue, she doesn't put up with bullshit, and there are so many layers to her character that she is deeply in love with her husband and eventually wins him over. And then once she finally meets the rogue father-in-law, he is a leery, I was going to say skabe, that's Japanese. Yeah, hentai is Japanese. He's a lech. And so then there's a whole bunch of other dynamics in the home. And what Anukrti Upadhyay does amazingly well in this novel is to add so much nuance in such a short little book, add so much nuance to all of those characters so that you hate the abuse that's happening, the violence, the misogyny, and you can't help but be impressed by other aspects of these men's characters, which makes for an uncomfortable read. And then the story ends with a bang. And the more I talk about it, the more I realize that I loved it even more than I did 45 minutes ago. It's really tough. I loved it. You should try it, but I would suggest starting with Daura. It's quite a different story than this. This one was incredible in its own way too. I have one more book that Anukrti Upadhyay has published in English, Kintsugi, which I will be reading very soon, and then I'm gonna invite her back onto Zoom to chat about all of her writing. On the basis of this, she is now one of my very most favorite writers. Do check it out. And I have started one book that I haven't finished yet, and that is this novel from, when is it from? 1947, from the UK, Chatterton Square by E.H. Young. And boy, this is starting out to be a meaty, very interesting novel so far. I haven't read a whole lot. No, I've read... Oh, you know what? I was going to say, I've only read 4 pages. That's not true. I found this print horrendously small. Way too small for my old man eyes, so I got the ebook, and I'm reading it with big print. With this tiny print, it's 350 pages. So it's a 550-page novel with normal print, and I'm reading it on ebook and I'm quite a bit farther into it than page 4. I've read a couple chapters. I presume it's London, but you know me, I don't pay too much attention. It's definitely in the UK in an urban setting, and it's about the various members of on the same street. And there's a married couple, and the man is a stick in the mud. He's not a violent man, but he's got a lot of very sexist, old school ideas, as most British men certainly did in the late 1940s, and I'm not going to make any comments about how far that carries up to the present day, but please weigh in the comments. With a wife and daughters, and he is wary of the young, beautiful widow down the street or across the street because she has flirted with him, and he's just being an old poop about it. She probably didn't flirt with him. Anyway, that's part of the opening premise of the story, and this young widow is an interesting character, and she's got an old maid friend, a spinster friend, Miss Spanner, and I don't have much else to say about it. I think the writing is really good, and it's, the characters are emerging so far as full-bodied characters. I'm impressed. I'm doing this as a pseudo-buddy read with Linny, who was just on another episode, the latest episode of Bite Size Book Chats that I put up this week, and she and I are going to meet up on Zoom and talk about this book in early November. The only other book that I read, Tea is So Intoxicating, is that what it is? I think so. By Mary Essex, I didn't like at all, but this one is quite a different animal altogether so far. So, the readathon, formerly known as Indigathon, is starting in November. It is now Skoden, and it is hosted by the absolutely wonderful Kim of Native Lady Book Warrior. I'll put a link to that announcement video in the show notes. I have recorded my TBR video. I'm hoping to put it out early next week. I am so excited. My TBR is just ridiculously long, but boy oh boy am I gonna have a good time. Am I gonna have a great reading month in November. So stay tuned for my TBR. Do check out Kim's video. Skoden 2022 is going to be one of the highlights of my year on BookTube and my reading life, if last year's Indigathon was any indication. In the coming week, I want to focus on finishing up some of the bigger books, longer books that you haven't heard me mention for weeks, if not months, to clear a space for my Skoden reading. But this was one that I told you I was going to start, and I didn't really get started on it. And this is an Indigenous memoir, I believe, Finding Lost by Nancy LaFleur. And I loved the first 5 or 6 pages that I read, but I haven't even put it on my Goodreads that I've started it, just because I knew I wasn't going to finish it. I may defer this for Skoden, but that would just be one other, albeit small, addition to my Skoden TBR. But I think I have a feeling this is going to be a powerful book. The one book that I am going to start this week, and hopefully finish, if not in the next week, certainly in the next 10 days or so, is this novella by the queer, campy as all get out British novel of the early 20th century, Ronald Firbank, Caprice. This is going to be a pseudo-buddy read with Curtis of Curtis Books and Books, and we're going to meet up on Zoom in early November once we're both finished. He has already read it, but he's going to reread it, I think. He doesn't have to, but he might, and I haven't read it. I'm more interested in Ronald Firbank's life story than I am in his writing based on the one other novella that I read. I think I remember the title, Concerning the Eccentricities of Cardinal Pirelli. Here's the gif. And I just found that really a tough slog. There was things about it that were fascinating, but when I had to look up an average of 3 words in each sentence, it was just kind of it made my brain hurt. A challenging read. I hope this one won't be quite that challenging and more enjoyable. I'll find out soon enough. I made Curtis giggle, I think, because I left him a Voxer message about this pseudo-buddy read a week or 2 ago, where I was a little too tipsy to be leaving a Voxer message and talking about the logistics of a buddy read, and my mind just blanked on the author's name. I said, Robert somebody, what the hell is his name? I can't remember his name. And Curtis said it was the best Voxer message he ever received, but it wasn't particularly practically informative. I hope to have more of my wits and sobriety about me when we talk about this novella. So I think that's all I have to say. What do you have to say? I would love to hear what you have to say in the comments below. And there's currently a 2-month delay before I answer comments. I am working on them. I've got to create more space in my life to catch up, but I am answering a handful of comments, a dozen or 2 comments weekly, and it's, I'm about 2 months behind the videos as they come out, but I certainly read your comments right away. Love receiving them, and I answer them in due course. I'm looking forward to getting caught up. Anyway, thanks for watching.